Hi, Mark.
Oh, hi, Susan. So thanks very much for doing this.
Yeah, no worries.
So I discovered your work after you wrote an article for The Conversation in the aftermath of the murder of Hannah Clark and her children. And so I was interested what you thought we were getting wrong about domestic violence.
Yeah, look, I think there are a number of things that we're getting wrong about domestic violence. I think, we have a very fractured and a really fragmented system that has really significant problems because there's a really massive jurisdictional gap between, federal law, which is at the level of the family law court, but at the same time, we've got child protection legislation and we've got, protection orders and the criminal law, which often is used in domestic violence cases, obviously, which are at the state and territory level. So I think that women and children who are seeking safety from domestic violence have an incredibly complicated system to try and navigate. So I think that's one issue that we're getting wrong. I think also we still have a very incident-based approach to responding to victims of domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence. What I mean by that is oftentimes it takes an incident of physical assault or sexualized violence against a victim to initiate any sort of response. So I think as a result, there's less concentration on looking at the kind of patterned nature of domestic violence, which contains a lot of coercive control at the basis of it. And so women who maybe are not victims of physical assaults frequently or sexualized violence frequently, I think they can tend to get missed, or they can tend to think that what's happening to them doesn't constitute domestic violence. Hence, they won't sort of seek help. Should I keep going?
Oh, well, I was interested in what you thought was required in terms of changes at the level of jurisprudence. I know that they've trialled coercive control laws. Maybe you can speak about that in the UK and Scotland to try and reduce perpetrator offending. But I suppose I'm interested in as well that I know Germaine Greer wrote an essay called On Rape, and she said that one of the problems was that it was still considered a crime against the state rather than a crime against an actual victim.
Yeah.
And we try to change that by bringing in victim impact statements and restorative justice. But to some extent, all violent crimes are crimes against the state. That's still how it works. So I was wondering what actually needs to change in relation to domestic violence cases.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think I've spoken to victims of violence who feel like in their own sort of court cases, they felt that they were simply sort of witnesses to a crime as opposed to the actual victim of that crime. And they are quite surprised oftentimes when they feel like the judicial system isn't actually there to be backing them as the object of concern. So I think that that is, very true. Judith Herman, who's an American psychiatrist, she wrote a really famous book, Trauma and Recovery, and she wrote in that book that, if you actually willfully set out to devise a legal system that was going to compound victims' trauma and kind of induce challenges, whether that PTSD or other challenges, that it would look like the system that we have. So I think, we've got this system that, really compounds the trauma. And I think oftentimes what victims of domestic violence experience in the private realm can actually be mirrored at the institutional level in terms of the public arena and those responses to women. So I speak to lots of victims of domestic violence who one of their major concerns is the really poor response that they received from multiple levels, whether that be in the court, whether that be from the police, whether that be from professionals, whether that be from, members of the community. I think some of the headlines that came out after the tragic murder of Hannah Clark and her children also kind of expressed that still at a societal level, there's just such a lack of understanding of what's happening when there are matters of domestic violence.
I know that there's been a lot of advocacy from feminists. You talk about femocrats in terms of influencing legislation. And the way that the media has changed in terms of the reports of domestic violence, there's no longer reports about men who snap and things like that in relation to, some sort of domestic stressor. What is the problem with the way that society understands domestic violence?
Yeah, look, I think that for lots of journalists, for example, that has changed. And I think there's been a lot of work after all the incredible work that Rosie Batty did. I think that things did seem like they were moving in the right direction, journalistic codes of ethics about how reports should be made, what language should be used. But then I think, in this instance, there were still lots of headlines about him snapping. You had the police officer in Queensland who was sort of stood down from the case, making a statement about we need to keep an open mind about what happened here.
That really raised some eyebrows, I think, as well.
Yeah, so I think that just really shows what a lot of women have said to me and to lots of other people, that they still feel that there's this kind of inherent bias where in this particular crime, it's like particular excuses seem to be offered up by people who are in positions of power at the kind of, the institutional levels of power.
Yes.
When you hear Pauline Hanson, she was also sort of openly, publicly, as a member of the Senate, actually saying, I was actually quite happy to hear Queensland Police speaking in that way, because it sort of shows that they're keeping an open mind and a lot of men are pushed too far. And then I think the example of just even having a commission and having someone who's so openly biased and publicly made statements that kind of intimated that women lie in the context of the family law court. So I agree with you. There are lots of examples where things seem to be improving from the media standpoint, but there still remains a huge amount of work to be done. Another example, just of this kind of at an institutional sort of political level, I worked for a long time in child protection. Child protection services, I think, are improving the way that they respond to families when there's domestic violence. But, there's still that sort of undertone, that discourse about women who fail to protect their children. And there's still so much emphasis on sort of placing women who experience domestic violence under the microscope, assessing their parenting capacity, but not at the same time actually going back to the person that's causing the harm to children and really trying to work with them and hold them accountable.